In most historical references, escort carriers tend to fall by the wayside. They were quiet workhorses, keeping the fleet supplied and covering landings. Important duties, but not the glamorous kind that popular history latches onto, with of course the exception of the Battle of Samar. However, these ships had their own roles to play and are worth remembering, such as today's topic, USS Kitkun Bay. For all that she's overlooked, Kitkun Bay and her pilots do deserve to be remembered more, including those injured in a kamikaze strike after the Japanese fleet withdrew. We'll definitely be looking at all of this in more detail during this video. First, however, we have to look at the design of the ship and her early service. Samar came at the end of October 1944. Kitkun Bay formally joined service in the middle of December 1943. There's a good gap there that needs to be covered first. Well, second, because we'll start with the design details. In this regard, Kitkun Bay was one of many escort carriers pumped out by American shipyards during the 1940s. In her case, one of the 50-strong Casablanca class. Despite their relatively small size, these mass-produced ships would prove themselves time and time again. For Kitkun Bay, this saw a displacement of 8,200 or so tons at the standard loading, with a heavier 10,900 at the full load. Despite that light tonnage, however, the ships did have a useful flight deck. One of these ships was 512 feet, 156 meters long, with a 474-foot, 144-meter long flight deck. The beam was 65 feet, 20 meters, while the flight deck's width reached 80 feet, or 24 meters. This allowed the ship to carry and operate around 27 to 30 aircraft, depending on the type. Most often, some mix of FM Wildcats and TBM Avengers. The former were General Motors built versions of the venerable F4F, featuring improved engines, among other modernizations. The latter were similarly General Motors built versions of the TBF Avenger. Defensive weaponry was fairly light by comparison. A single 5-inch gun mounted on the stern, along with 8 40mm Bofors guns and 12 20mm cannon. Later in the war, this increased to 30 20mm cannon and 16 Bofors guns. That was it for defense, however, because these ships lacked any armor. So let's round things off with the speed. This was a modest 19 knots, provided by 2 old-style reciprocating engines. One of the measures taken to reduce cost and speed up construction. In service, however, those engines worked well enough for the vast majority of situations. The ships didn't need to be fast after all, because they were never meant to get close to the enemy. As Kitkun Bay could tell you, that wasn't always the case, although her service began much quieter, with Samar a distant speck in the future. The ship was laid down by the Kaiser shipyard in Vancouver, Washington on May 3, 1943. As was typical for the Kaiser-built ships, she wouldn't spend long in that yard. Kitkun Bay was launched on November 8, 1943, and commissioned on December 15, 1943. A bit over half a year from keel laying to commissioning. It was, after all, why Kaiser built these things in the first place. That said, this was just the formal commissioning. The ship still needed to work up and train her pilots among other things. This would keep her busy through January 1944, with Kitkun Bay only departing the west coast on January 27, 1944. Not for combat duty, but as an aircraft transport. One of the more understated, but certainly important role for the Jeep carriers. Many a Marine pilot would have his aircraft delivered by one of these ships in the last couple years of the war. The same went for Army pilots as well. This first voyage would see Kitkun Bay set sail on January 27th, arriving at her destination on February 14th. Once there, she would drop off 17 Marine TBF Avengers and pick up mail and passengers for a return trip to Pearl Harbor, arriving there on February 28th, albeit only temporarily. The ship continued on to San Diego, where she would dock on March 6, 1944. Nothing particularly noteworthy to this point, which would continue through the start of May 1944 as Kitkun Bay stuck around the West Coast for more training. She would work up her Air Wing Composite Squadron 5, VC-5 to use the military designation, as well as other air groups destined for different ships. Training pilots was, after all, the other understated but incredibly important duty for these ships. It was only at the end of May, after a stint at Pearl Harbor, that the ship finally set sail for proper combat duty. Alongside her sister Gambier Bay, the carrier joined up with a bombardment force. Together, those ships would escort Transport Division 16 on the way to the invasion of the Marianas. This part of the voyage was uneventful, with the group arriving at Kwajalein on June 8th. However, when Kitkun Bay set sail again, she would soon see her first combat. On June 13th, 4 of her Wildcats intercepted a lurking Japanese bomber, a G4M Betty, which was promptly shot down. Not a major victory, but it was the first blood drawn by VC-5 and USS Kitkun Bay, and by no means the last. Her pilots would spend the next few days providing support to the forces ashore, until on June 17th, the Japanese began to probe the American fleet. A group of Japanese aircraft, dive bombers and torpedo bombers, attacked the escort carriers, with 4 torpedo bombers in particular attacking Kitkun Bay. These were shot down, although one did drop a torpedo in the carrier's direction. Fortunately, that missed. The following day, June 18th, more aircraft would attack. These went down in flames, sometimes pretty close to American ships. But once more, Kitkun Bay evaded any damage, despite this plane in particular crashing quite close indeed. However, it would be June 19th where the real attack would begin, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, or the Marianas Turkey Shoot. During this, hundreds of Japanese aircraft would be downed attempting to attack the American fleet. It was one of the single largest naval operations of the war, but Kitkun Bay was, for the most part, left alone. Only a handful of Japanese pilots tried to attack this ship. For the rest of June, Kitkun Bay remained off the Marianas, providing support to the troops ashore, before taking a short break at Eniwetok on July 5th to resupply. This would last until the 10th of July, when she was right back to the Marianas. The carrier would send planes to attack shore targets through to early August before departing once more. Kitkun Bay would spend August 1944 on resupply and minor refits after a hectic 2 months of combat duty. With the ship returning to that work in early September as she sailed for the Palau Islands. Though a somewhat embarrassing incident came first on September 13th. Kitkun Bay hit a large log which lodged in the bow. For about 45 minutes, she was reduced in speed by a knot until the log worked itself free. Kitkun Bay would then set up off Peleliu on the 15th, where she would remain for 6 days to provide support for the Marines ashore, during which a Wildcat was damaged when an ammunition dump went up with enough force to buffet the plane. Fortunately, the pilot landed ashore, but it does show how very close air supports can be quite dangerous, for reasons entirely unrelated to enemy ground fire. That aside, the carrier would depart on the 21st for a short rest period at Ulithi, before setting sail for Seadler Harbor, where she would spend October 1st through the 11th preparing for her next operation. This time, the liberation of the Philippines. Early airstrikes took place on the 18th and the 19th to lay the groundwork for the invasion. An invasion that saw Kitkun Bay arrive off Leyte on October 20th, as part of Taffy 3. For 5 days, she supported the troops ashore. Those 5 days were largely uneventful for the ship, resembling her other ground support missions. Events like Sibuyan Sea on October 24th involved the fleet carriers more than the escorts. This would, of course, all change in legendary fashion on October 25th, 1944. The Battle of Samar, as the Japanese center force steamed over the horizon. This is a well-trodden topic, so I won't linger too long here. The short version is, after the Northern Force drew off Admiral Halsey and most of 3rd Fleet, the center force, battered and bruised as it was, snuck past. Under Admiral Kurita, this formation caught Taffy 3 largely unprepared. Scout aircraft had located the Japanese formation, but no one had expected it, and the Americans were forced to improvise. Around 6:50 a.m., Taffy 3 made steam to run from the Japanese. All the while, calls for help were sent out, and the carriers launched their aircraft. At the same time, the escorts, 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, moved to make smoke and cover the carriers. In the early stages of the action, Kitkun Bay avoided most of the Japanese attention. This was directed instead towards Fanshawe Bay and White Plains. The first salvo to straddle Kitkun came at 7:09 with Yamato's 5th volley. Soon after, several more salvos landed close astern. The carrier avoided any direct hits, but it was still incredibly dangerous. Even more so when Kitkun Bay opened fire with her stern 5-inch gun at 7:40. She would ultimately fire 120 out of 180 shells aboard the ship during this battle. As for the Japanese shell fire, the closest hits, some 50 yards astern, did only splinter damage. Kitkun Bay's air group did much more damage, particularly to Chokai. A diagram from Combined Fleet here was drawn by one of her pilots. Mislabeled as a Mogami, but it shows the bomb hits. The wreck shows damage at nearly every single spot here. It wasn't just VC-5 that attacked Chokai, but they still did work here. Chikuma was also hit later in the day by 2 torpedoes. In any event, the Japanese were driven off by the brave actions of Taffy 3's escorts, as well as swarms of aircraft from the American carriers, including the other Taffy formations. Unfortunately, the saga wasn't over yet. Kitkun Bay sighted a group of 5 Zeros at 10:49. One of those attempted a kamikaze dive, but missed the bridge, instead slamming into the catwalk with the bomb detonating as it crashed. This fortunately caused relatively minor damage, and only killed one of the crew. It is, however, commonly cited as the first intentional kamikaze strike, if only by a few minutes, as Callinan Bay and St. Lo also suffered in this attack. Around 11:17, 15 torpedo bombers would also attack. Debris from one of those attackers killed another man, but still did minimal damage. Nonetheless, the carrier did need repairs. Kitkun Bay would reach Seattler Harbor on November 1st before sailing on for Pearl Harbor. She arrived there on November 18th and would finish her work on November 29th. She would return to the Philippines in January 1945 for, as it turned out, her short-lived final combat operation. On January 8th, a group of Japanese aircraft attacked the formation. One managed to slam into Kitkun Bay at the amidships waterline. 16 men were lost and another 37 were wounded. More critically, a 20-foot-long hole extending 3 feet below the waterline was torn in the side. The carrier lost power and took on a 13-degree list to port. Ultimately, Kitkun Bay would survive the damage. The crew restored power, and she was able to do limited flight operations until January 11th. At this point, though, the ship was sent off for repair. By February 1945, she was in the United States, where repairs would last until April, although further work kept her in port until June. She would only rejoin combat in July, serving in strikes on the Japanese home islands through early August. Once the Japanese surrendered, Kitkun Bay would initially sail to Alaskan waters, before helping in the occupation of the northern Japanese home islands at the start of September 1945. After this, the ship rounded off her service on magic carpet runs, bringing POWs and servicemen home, with Kitkun Bay finally decommissioned on April 19, 1946, with the ship scrapped in early 1947. While she's not as famous as others, the ship still earned 6 battle stars and the Presidential Unit Citation that the rest of Taffy 3 also received. Not a bad record at all. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.